As you can see from my title, it's what Blade Runner 2049 has to teach us about the nature of Christ. So let us just dive right in, and I hope you enjoy. So I wanted to kind of begin with a quote by Albert Einstein. So he once said, science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. I'd like to personally manipulate Einstein's quote a little bit and say science fiction without religion is lame, and religion without science fiction is blind. Obviously, I don't mean this as a kind of end-all be-all, but I do think that there's a nugget of truth nestled within that statement, that sci-fi and religious studies can symbiotically benefit one another because they both explore human otherness, and they're concerned with development of self and development of societies. And I think you can particularly see this kind of relationship when you look at posthumanism and transhumanism stories within kind of the science fiction genre. And I think like they can be paralleled with spirituality quite well, because they're focused on advancement and development. And so in let me move my slide to this lovely quote, but in his book The Singularity is Near, When Humans Transcend Biology, Ray Kurzweil writes about this rather natural correlation between posthumanism and religious notions of divinity when he says, evolution moves towards greater complexity, greater elegance, greater knowledge, greater intelligence, greater beauty, greater creativity, greater love. And God has been called all these things, only without any limitations. Evolution does not achieve an infinite level, but as it explodes exponentially, it certainly moves in this direction. Thus, the freeing of our thinking from the severe limitations of its biological form may be regarded as an essentially spiritual quest. So, kind of developing this idea and bridging it directly to Christianity, I feel like is an easy move to make, because at the very core of Christianity is the dynamic of human redemption and transformation. Christian theology grounds this transformation in its distinctive view of God, who enters the human condition in order to transform it. Zooming in on this connection even further, transhumanism and posthumanism, I believe, are excellent frameworks to specifically study the character and nature of Jesus Christ. Christian theology has long been intrigued by the conundrum that Christ's existence falls on both spectrums of human and divine otherness. There has been many debates as to where he falls upon this spectrum. Some say he's more divine with only a small amount of human, and others say the reverse. I think these same types of questions quickly enter the playing field when examining posthuman or transhuman beings. Questions like, how human is this artificial intelligence? Does this cyborg have a soul? Can robots feel? So these are kind of the questions that are prompted with that. And none of these queries have easy answers, but I think in asking them, they can provide incredible insights, especially to self-identifying Christian people when they're explored. So again, science fiction provides this kind of perfect playing field, in my opinion, for spiritual questions. Sci-fi film in particular, I think, provides audiences with a means of viewing either the visual response or the visual journey connected to these questions. Additionally, science fiction and its connected subdivisions may provide modern individuals a more manageable way to explore the nature of divinity. So what I mean by that is, for a person steeped in a technological world, they may find terms and mediums such as AI, machinery, and biotechnology as an accessible way for them to engage with theological questions rather than diving into sacrificial rites, priestly behaviors, or other ancient cultural traditions. Building upon that, when audiences enter through the gate of science fiction, they may be willing to suspend their disbelief in a way they wouldn't otherwise when a subject is labeled strictly as spiritual or religious. This paper aims to show kind of how we can bridge or kind of tie in posthumanism and transhumanism with a Christian theology, as well as how we can look at a sci-fi film to explore those things, as well as the nature of Christ. I'm going to use Blade Runner 2049 to kind of illustrate these points, and because I think it really highlights the nuances of these questions and these methods, and can really open up a Christian-minded reader to expand and fill their vision a little bit better on what it means to live a Christ-like experience. So an additional note on this paper, or this presentation, is that though I'll be looking at from a Christian perspective, I admit it will be a largely specific doctrine in terms of it'll correlate a lot with doctrine from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which sees the Godhead as distinctly separate beings, unified in their purpose alone. So their kind of embodiment is separate, but they're striving for the same goal. So when these interpretations are kind of especially prevalent, I'll try and highlight that as well in case there's any confusion. But I think Blade Runner 2049 is a particular, or ought to be of particular interest to members of the Church of Jesus Christ, because the story focuses on the embodiment of Christ, as well as his ability to champion all people. And there's a particular emphasis on his feminine qualities that can be seen as a means of elevating marginalized groups that exist not only in the world, but I also think within the membership of the LDS Church. So let's dive into this next slide as to why Blade Runner 2049 is kind of where I'm going with this. So the Blade Runner texts, or kind of universe, if you will, include the original book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, and of course the first Blade Runner film, which was based off of that book. Blade Runner 2049 is a sequel that builds off of the film adaptation of Philip K. Dick's novel. Both of these are, not both, all of these works are well suited for exploration of theological questions. So as David Desser put in his article on Blade Runner, Science Fiction and Transcendence, he says, Blade Runner should be seen as a cycle of transcendental science fiction, precisely because of its roots in Philip K. Dick's novel and the way it uses cinematic and literary illusions. In his article, Desser connects Blade Runner to Paradise Lost and illustrates how those two texts, with the common theme of fallen beings and their search for redemption, kind of come together. Additionally, those two pieces could be seen as a response to the question, what does it look like to transcend one's circumstances, and is that even possible for those in a fallen state? A question that intensely concerns figures in Blade Runner 2049. Of course, this paper and presentation is not the first to identify any of these concepts. Both Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and its movie adaptation Blade Runner have been abundantly appraised by scholarship. And although Blade Runner 2049 is only a few years old, it too has not been neglected from appraisal, with publications such as Blade Runner 2049, A Philosophical Exploration, which compiles many wonderful articles that focus on the latest installment of the Blade Runner universe. Yeah, even though these articles are fabulous and engage with some metaphysical aspects, they're mainly focused on philosophical questions, and there hasn't been many focused on messianic connection that I believe the film is blatantly making. So the characters and the plot in Blade Runner 2049 focuses a lot on kind of liminal space between living in a fallen state and a higher, more divine one. So a space that is also a kind of existence that's occupied by Jesus Christ as well. He's in between the divine and the mortal existence. Another enriching aspect of this film that's been overlooked, or at least not looked at enough, in my opinion, is the feminine Christ figure that is later on presented. And so before I dive into that, I think a brief summary of the film will be helpful. Blade Runner 2049's plot takes off when it's discovered that a replicant has given birth, something that's thought to be impossible. Replicants are manufactured beings that look like humans but possess superior skills, like strength or longer lifespans, but they can't procreate, or at least they aren't supposed to be able to. This watershed revelation is what concerns the rest of the film. Its main character, Kay, who later on is referred to as Joe, but we're just going to call him Kay for our purposes. He works with the police force as what's known as a Blade Runner. So he goes out and retires or kills older generation replicants. He's dispatched to kind of find this miraculous child. And in that kind of detective work he does, he starts to believe that maybe he himself is that miracle child, which he isn't. The person he's looking for is named Dr. Anna Stelline, who works making memories to implants into replicants to kind of augment their humanity. And the film ends, spoiler, with Kay dying after he unites Dr. Stelline with her father, who is played by Rick Decker from the original Blade Runner movie. Both Kay and Dr. Stelline, I feel like, serve as symbolic saviors that kind of give insight to a Christian spiritual journey as well as Christ's identity. So first, we'll look at Kay and kind of who and what he embodies, and then we'll kind of move on from there. So, our friend Kay. So, as mentioned before, he's a replicant that works for the police force, and he struggles with whether or not he has a soul. At first, he's not super concerned with this, but as he looks further and further into this case of this mystery child, he becomes increasingly concerned with his own salvation, if you will. And it's interesting because this denotes a type of change within himself, and he begins to gain a type of autonomy over his actions that wasn't there previously. In the introduction of Transcendence and Transhumanism, they identify this popular Christian theme of transformation along a spiritual path when they say, Paul's theology is full of the paradox of transforming grace, whereby the old self is put to death and the new self, the new identity of the Christian in Christ, comes into existence, yet without the disappearance of the old body or the total negation of the old behavior. In searching out divinity, the old Kay dies off and a new, more autonomous one emerges. However, life as enlightened Kay is short-lived. He dies at the end of the film, and in some ways it mimics Christ's death a little bit. He ends up in a fight with kind of the antagonist's main henchwoman, and she stabs him in the side. And this wound proves to be fatal. And of course, Christ, when he was crucified, not only were hands put in his nails put in his hands and feet, but also he was speared in the side. And it's interesting because prior to his death, he is being taken care of by the underground replicant movement, and they tell him that dying for a cause is the most human thing we can do. So, in kind of choosing to unite Dr. Stelline with Rick Deckard, he risks his life and ends up dying, but it ends up being transcendent and unifying, not only for himself, but for a larger group of people, which momentarily makes him a type of Christ figure, which is very interesting. This also, the ending kind of shot after you kind of realized his wounds are fatal. The camera sees him kind of from a overhead viewpoint that's often called like a godlike perspective, and he is against this like snowy staircase, which just made me think of potentially that's an allusion to Isaiah 118 when it says, "Come now and let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool." Individually speaking, Kay has a lot of blood on his hands from the nature of his job as a Blade Runner. Yet this unifying act of bringing the father in connection with the miraculous child kind of allows him to atone from those things. His sins are made to be white, like pure wool. And on top of that, this reference to pure wool immediately calls to mind the title of the original kind of work, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? This scene can show that it doesn't matter what replicants dream of, because they are still sheep who are under the watchful care of the Almighty Shepherd, which is Dr. Stelline and Kay, and they can not only be forgiven but made whole. So Kay becoming a human, like, or fully human in his sacrifice, he's made whole, and I think that's a beautiful connection. But for Dr. Stelline, who is the more prominent and obvious Christ figure, there's a lot of reasons for this. So first of all, when you meet her, she's wearing white. White is a traditional signifier of purity and holiness, which, even if you didn't cast her as a Christ figure immediately, I think it immediately positions her as a type of wise woman. And but it's a tip off. Another notable symbolic thing is that she lives in a dome, which is separated from the rest of the world. So this delineation puts her in a world apart, a separate sphere that could be considered a type of sacred ground or holy realm. And if that wasn't symbolic enough, we also have her name. So Anna, according to the very authoritative babynames.com, means gracious and merciful, and is also a popular Christian name. On top of that, her last name, Stelline, is Italian for of the stars, which again connects her to the heavens. And as far as doctor goes, we don't know what kind of doctor she is, if it's a medical doctor or an earned title of higher education, but whichever one it is, it has redemptive qualities. If it's a reference to exemplary knowledge, it shows that she's kind of conscious of, or that she has a greater awareness for thinking and being concerned with others, which is similar to Christ, because he was also aware of a higher calling. He knew he'd have to introduce a new law to replace the law of Moses and during his lifetime, and that he would one day have to redeem humanity. If we see her as a medicinal doctor, she automatically becomes a healer, like Christ in the New Testament, reaching out to the publicans and the sinners, connecting with the lowest of the low, which again are the replicants in their society, in order to kind of raise them up. So when you weave all of these details together, I think you can make a strong case that she is a Christ figure. But I don't think it stops there. If we move on from those initial symbols and we look at her profession a little bit deeper, she's got a reputation for being the best memory maker. So with that, there's this great quote from Richard Hearsmink and Christopher Jude McCarroll from their article, The Best Memories and Identity, Narrative, and Objects, which deals with Blade Runner 2049. And they say, memory is a commodity called upon and consumed by the Wallace Corporation, purchased from the memory maker, Dr. Anna Stelline, who constructs and implants the best memories. In replicants, so to instill in them real human responses. Memory is ubiquitous in Blade Runner 2049. involving humans, replicants, objects, and machines. Even God, we are told, remembered Rachel. And though ultimately their paper is concerned with more philosophical elements, they sketch a connection, I think, especially clear in this quote, between humanness, memories, and divinity. For members of the Church of Jesus Christ, we are often taught that every human being is born with what's called the light of Christ. This is often referred to as a sort of inner seed of holiness that can serve as a guide towards growth and goodness. But in Blade Runner 2049, I think we can view the memories that Dr. Stelline makes and implants as a similar functioning seed. It's implanted into replicants as a means of elevating their humanity, of kind of allowing them to, I think, reach for greater growth and to guide them towards a more human and whole experience. And what's particularly strong as well, so with Kay being a Christ figure, he has memories implanted in him from Dr. Stelline that are actually her own memories. So they're not even made up. They're real and they belong to someone. And so that ties them together even more, which I think is really interesting. And if we eschewed all of these evidences that I've kind of laid out so far, I think we'd still have to call Dr. Stelline a Christ figure because of her miraculous birth. She was born of a replicant, just like Christ was born of a virgin. Two impossible mothers, each bringing a symbol of redemption into the world. It's surprising to Kay and potentially some of the audience when they watch the film that the miracle child is, in fact, a woman in Blade Runner 2049. However, I believe this feminine presentation of a Redeemer sheds light on Christ's character. In the LDS tradition, an apostle named James E. Talmage once wrote, "The world's greatest champion of woman and womanhood is Jesus the Christ." Expanding upon this statement, Christ is not the epitome of hypermasculinity as defined by Western society today, but rather he embodies many feminine qualities, such as caring for others, particularly those on the margins of society. He's gentle, he nurtures. And when we see a female Christ figure, I think Blade Runner 2049 invites us to honor these feminine qualities, not just in Christ, but in all of us, especially when we find ourselves in leadership positions. As a Christian, to dismiss the implication of Anna's gender in this film is to limit ourselves not only to the possible interpretations, but also it puts fences around our own understanding of what a Christ-like individual looks like and is. So let's move on to some other characters that I feel like also augment the readings of Dr. Stelline as a Christ figure and Kay as a person on a spiritual journey. So outside of them, the two figures that I really want to look at are Jared Leto's character, Neander Wallace, who's the head of the Wallace Corporation. I feel like he acts as a stark foil to these two figures, and he represents a type of antichrist or a Satan figure. There's also Harrison Ford's character of Rick Deckard from the original Blade Runner movie, who I believe can be correlated to God the Father. And he helps illustrate how Christ plays a central role in unifying fallen beings with the highest manifestation of the divine. So to kind of start with Neander Wallace, he is important because he invented the technology needed to grow food on like off-planet sites, because the world in Blade Runner is crumbling and decaying and dying, and he, in a way, offers salvation for the human race. And so, as founder and owner of this corporation, he's granted special permission to produce replicants after there was this huge blackout. He created replicants that were 100% obedient, meaning they would go as far to kill themselves if you were to tell them to do so. So Wallace can be described as a type of antichrist because he's a figure who has similar qualities to Christ. You know, he's got a large following, he's got a mission that people kind of buy into, that is under the guise of salvation, but ultimately he lacks the pure intent and true power of Jesus Christ. So with that, like, this is also exemplified in his desire to create replicants who can procreate. He keeps trying to tweak things and change things in the replicants he's manufacturing, but he just can't do it. And I think that's a way of showing that he has no real authority. He has no real power. What's interesting too is that his right hand kind of henchwoman is named Love, and her name is spelled Luv, which is again a knockoff of the true form of love. So she, much like she echoes Wallace's intent and his twisted wishes, and she's a destroying angel rather than a harbinger of good news. I also think we can see Wallace as a type of Satan, because similar to the temptations of Christ, Wallace tries to tempt divinity. Deckard, if we use kind of Deckard as the symbol for divinity or God the Father, Wallace tries to tempt him by making a replicant or a new version of Rachel, the woman who gave birth to the miraculous replicant child and who Deckard was in love with, but she's now dead. And so even though she's a pretty convincing model, she's still a counterfeit. And Deckard is able to see through that and see through those illusions and not give in to Wallace's kind of demands or wishes or play the role that he wants him to. I think members of the Church of Jesus Christ can also see Wallace as Satan in another way, when we think about kind of this story of the premortal existence. Members of the LDS Church believe that Satan proposed a plan in heaven where he would make sure that everyone was 100% obedient, ultimately stripping everyone of their autonomy. Jesus Christ, then offered a different plan that would allow people to make their own choices, and that he would stand in and atone for people's shortcomings and the injustices of the world, similar to, I think, how Kay's sacrifice functions in the world of Blade Runner 2049. If we move on to Rick Deckard, we can kind of view him as a type of God the Father, most obviously because he's the father of the miracle child. On top of that, similar to Dr. Stelline, he lives separately from the rest of the world. In fact, he resides in this orange-lit kind of remnants of Las Vegas. So even though Vegas may be considered a vulgar place, I think it's still steeped in a particular type of glory, even if that's a worldly or more secular glorification. The profane elements don't negate its sacredness. What's interesting is there's also a swarm of bees when Kate goes to find Deckard in this deserted Vegas, and which I think is a allusion towards a type of promised land. When you think of promised land, it's often referenced as a land of milk and honey. And so if there's bees there, there's got to be honey. And even if that's not the reason, Deckard's kind of isolated and separate life shows that he's not of the rest of the world. This is, I think, reminiscent of a view of God in that he can be a detached being who sets things into motion but is not intimately involved in human life or replicant life in the film. He even says, Deckard at one point, sometimes to love someone, you have to be a stranger. So though this may be a heartbreaking line, all is made well by the end of the film when the father and the son, or Dr. Stelline, the miracle child, are reunited thanks to the efforts of K. And kind of conclude and hit on the main points again. I wanted to give this presentation because I do believe that science fiction and religious studies can have a symbiotic relationship. They can benefit one another and offer one another new audiences, but also new symbols and new methodologies to explore the deeper questions of life. With that, I think posthumanism and transhumanism often correlate to actually spiritual journeys and spiritual questions and what it means to truly be human. Blade Runner 2049, I believe, is a film that has a lot of religious angles that are worth exploring. I've only shared a few today. I've left out other characters who I think would be interesting to talk about in terms of what they mean for a religious experience. And then a big part that I wanted to focus on, obviously, was this female Christ figure of Dr. Stelline. I think examining a female-bodied Christ figure helps a Christian person have a greater understanding of Jesus Christ, because it shows different parts of his personality, and it shows how he's able to connect with all people. And I also think it highlights on his unexpected nature. Christ was not the savior everyone thought he was going to be. They were looking for a type of kind of warrior to lead them, to separate them from their oppression. But instead, he came to relieve them of their kind of metaphysical oppression. So I think more female-bodied Christ figures should be examined and looked at. And then I kind of mentioned this already, but I think sci-fi can provide a modern and accessible means of exploring life's big questions. I think we're, as a society, a little bit more removed from ritual practices and symbols that, like lilies often appear in kind of older sacred art. And like, I don't think we're as in touch with those symbols as communities used to be. But I think sci-fi stories can take that place and provide a rich means of people exploring and living up to their full experience. So that's my presentation, and I'd love to take any questions now if there are any.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions here. Somebody asked, what are the benefits of looking at religion through the lens of science fiction?
I think looking at religion through science fiction, I said earlier, like, that I think when some people, when they enter into science fiction, they suspend their disbelief a little bit more. They open themselves up more to the possibility of miraculous happenings. I think things that where you might be a little bit more skeptical if you're not looking at these events or themes through a fictional lens, then you might reject. But like, science fiction kind of opens that door. I also think science fiction in particular, as opposed to just like fiction, in some ways fiction may swing a little too far. That could very much be like a personal opinion there too, that you're like, well, of course I believe that this is fictional. I'm not feeling the weight of the credibility. But I think science fiction, with its references to technology or science, or things that are very tangibly real and things that we interact with on a more daily basis in this day and age, can also ground people a little bit as well. for those that are maybe more skeptical of religion as a whole.
Excellent. Thank you. Do you think the parallels to Christianity in the film are intentional or more of an unconscious connection?
I think they're intentional. I think there could be some that are not intended. Obviously, like I did a lot of kind of analysis through an LDS Christian lens, which I don't think anybody had those things in mind at all when they were making this film. So I think you could take things that weren't intended, but writing a storyline that has such a miraculous birth, I don't see how you can't connect that to a Christ figure, and other stories, and like the kind of quote I mentioned earlier too, Philip K. Dick's work, and Blade Runner, and just Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep are pretty spiritually based. So I think the religious connections are pretty intentional.
Thank you. What was the most unexpected parallel you found in Blade Runner?
The most unexpected parallel, I think one that I didn't, that kind of seeped in a little bit more when writing this paper was actually Love, who's the henchwoman, the right hand woman of Neander Wallace, who I kind of only briefly mentioned. She plays kind of a bigger role in the film, and the fact that her name is just spelled LUV in kind of the IMDb script, I thought was really profound. It just really shows that she's not real love, and she's so kind of stuck in her mindset that what she's doing is the right thing to do, when I think as a viewer you are kind of positioned against that. um, so that I really liked that connection. I also think just kind of diving a little bit more into Dr. Stelline and like her situation and what she's wearing. um, I didn't necessarily notice those things the first time around as intensely, so those were a little unexpected. But I thought Love was an incredible character.
Excellent. And then somebody asked, what are some other science fiction films that you think have a similar connection to Christ?
Other science fiction films. Um, this, gosh, I wish my mind has like gone blank. In some ways, what I've been watching recently, that kind of ties into that. I feel like there's a lot of spiritual, at least stories, and maybe not so much Christ figures, but in a lot of anime, I like to watch a lot of series, and I feel like there's a lot of um, technological elements or fantastical elements that are somewhat sci-fi. So depending on what show we're talking about, um, there are elements there. Um, I don't know. I think that is probably a better question for you to kind of maybe explore is, what sci-fi films speak to you, and do they speak to you? Like, can you find those symbols? And do you think that was intentional or kind of offhanded?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Um, that's all we've got for questions. So if you want to give any closing remarks and where to find you.
Oh, thank you so much for coming to my presentation. If you'd like to hear more from me, I guess just Googling my name periodically would be one way. Um, I like to write, poetry, but also have other papers. I have a paper on sacred time and the work of Makoto Shinkai that you can also read if that's something that sparks your interest. If you'd like to reach out to me a little more personally, You can find me on Instagram at KISCHREIBER, and just shoot me a message if there's something you'd like to talk about.